Well, tonight I want to kind of look at just a few things. In the book of Deuteronomy, or the whole book of Deuteronomy, is Moses' farewell speech to the Israelites, right? They're about to go into the promised land, and he was told he was not going to be able to go. So he was giving his farewell speech. And over, if you read through Deuteronomy, he encourages them that they are going to go into a land flowing with milk and honey, right? That they're going to live in houses that they hadn't built, that they were going to eat from fields that they didn't have to plant. But then he also, over and over, he reminds them where they came from and how God has taken care of them over and over through the years. When you think about it, remember that except for Moses, Caleb, and Joshua, everybody standing there was under the age of 60. Okay? Most were under the age of 40. And so everybody else had died in the wilderness because of the rebellion and complaining, right? But yeah, everybody else had died. So if you think about the people over 40, which there weren't very many because most of them had died, but some of them had remembered Egypt, but not a lot of them. And even if you think about it, like I'm 60, but if I think about my memories of when I was 20 or younger, they're usually skewed. They're usually a lot better than what I thought what they were when we were going through it. It seemed a lot better living through it. But they're also tainted with the stories of your parents and your grandparents and whoever else is sitting around the table, right? And so you think you remember it one way, and they're like, yeah, it really wasn't that way. And then, because the older you get, the more you remember the details, and the more you remember the pain and the suffering that you went through, right? But think of the conversations, they're sitting around eating manna bread. And what are their parents going to say? Remember the vegetables we had in Egypt? Remember those leeks and those onions? And remember that mutton stew? Remember that roasted lamb? We're just sitting here eating manna bread or manna grub or manna whatever, And then what would they do? They would talk about their houses. Back in Egypt, we had a house. It wasn't a tent, it was a house. And we had comfortable beds. It wasn't a pallet on the ground. It was a comfortable bed. Remember, we would do that. Remember back in Egypt, we had a new dress for every festival. And they had a lot of festivals because they had a lot of gods. So they had a lot of festivals, but we got a new dress. But they probably didn't speak a lot about all the hardships around the table anyway. Passover, but they didn't really even practice Passover until they got into the new land. But Moses took that time to remind them of their slavery and of their deliverance. He took time to remind them that in Egypt they were slaves. Okay? Because if you think about it, in Egypt they were slaves and they had people that had to take care of them. Right? And like the Egyptians in Egypt, the Israelites had learned how to rely on the Nile River for their food. They had learned how to do all that. In Deuteronomy 11, verse 10, Moses said, "For the land which you go to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it by foot as a vegetable garden." He's like, in Egypt, they created dikes, like dams, and they created channels, and then they created these ponds. They call them basins, but ponds everywhere. And each year in late summer, the Nile would flood. And it would fill up all the land. And all these channels and all these ponds would be filled up. And the Nile would deposit a layer of silt to fertilize the ground. So the Egyptians, and at that time the Israelites, they could plant year-round because they had good soil and they had water year-round. And so they could plant whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and they just knew that the Nile was going to take care of it. Okay, they had water, and if the ponds got a little bit low, they just carried the water a little bit further. Okay, it always happened like clockwork. And so the people just planted their seed. They were self-reliant. They didn't have to worry about it. They didn't have to pray about it. They were self-reliant. Kind of like a lot of us who go to work, knowing our paycheck's going to be deposited in the bank. It's going to pay our bills. It's going to supply our needs, maybe even some of our wants. And we become comfortable with that day after day. It's just, it happens. We just, and then all of a sudden something will happen and you lose your job or an unexpected bill or medical bills happen or whatever. And then we have to learn how to rely on God. It's a different thing because when your paycheck's coming in every week, you don't think about praying, Lord, bless my daily bread, because you know your daily bread is going to be there. Right? It becomes a habit. So if we go back to Deuteronomy 8, starting at verse 2, Moses said, "And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, and to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commands or not. So he humbled you and allowed you to hunger, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Your garments did not wear out on you, neither did your foot swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart," this is verse 5, "you should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you." Now, remember, trials are not from God. We know that. In fact, James 1:13 says, "Let no man say when he is tempted or put in a trial, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone." That word tempt also means trial, right? And in James 1:12 it says, "But blessed is the man who endures that trial, who endures that temptation. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." So, first James is saying, blessed is the man who can endure this. And the second part, he's like, but God didn't do it to you. Okay? But God will use those times to prove us and to train us. So in the wilderness, suddenly the Israelites were totally reliant on God. They had supernatural food, they had supernatural clothes, they had supernatural health, they had everything. Even a shade overhead and warmth at night. Everything was supernatural, everything was given by God. And so they went from totally reliant basically on themselves and on their masters, and then they had to be reliant on God. Okay? I think this is kind of where we've been for the last several years. We've been totally reliant on God. We've watched him pay the bills. We watched him provide the food. He's kept us in clothes. He's kept our health. And now we're about to cross over. This is where God told Joshua, make sure that the ark goes out first, because you've not passed this way before. Okay? Now remember, when they had gotten to the Jordan River the first time, they sent out spies. And the spies went out and told them what was in the land. They knew what was there 40 years ago. But now it's 40 years later. How much stuff changes in 40 years? Okay. And you notice that Joshua didn't send out spies. He learned the lesson the first time. He wasn't going to send out people. Okay, so people screw up things. So they had to know that things changed. There was they fortified their cities. Rulers had changed. The way that they were going to have to fight had changed. The timetable had changed. It was not the same way. If they had gone in the first time, would they have gone to Jericho? We don't know. What had changed during those 40 years? So now they had to totally rely on God's instruction, because they weren't going to go and find out what was in the land. They knew that God knew, and we're just going to follow God. So, a lot of times we think we know what it looks like, but it's going to be a whole new way of life, a whole new way of doing things, and we can't take it for granted. Okay? In Egypt, they relied on the Nile, the consistent routine of doing things. In the wilderness, they relied on God and his faithfulness. But now they're going in. Now Moses was saying now you're going into this new place. What does this new place look like? If we go back over to Deuteronomy 11, starting on verse 11, he said, "But the land which you cross over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the very end of the year. And it shall be that if you earnestly obey my commandments, which I command you today, to love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, your new wine, and your oil. And I will send grass in your fields for your livestock, that you may eat and be filled." So now what were the Israelites required to do? They were required to keep God's command and stay in covenant. Now they had to rely on God to provide the early and the latter rains. But the early and latter rain was with an if they obey God's command and if they stayed in covenant. Okay? And their planting and reaping all had to rely on God's timetable for the rain. They didn't want to plant at the wrong season because the rain wouldn't come and their seed would dry up. Or if they planted too late or too early, then their fields would be washed out and their seed would be gone. They had to rely on waiting for God's rain and then doing what they're supposed to do, whether it's planting, because I always forget which one's which. But one, they plant, the other one, they reap the harvest, whichever one's which. Okay? But they couldn't rely on the Nile, so they couldn't plant whenever they wanted to. You know, they had the Jordan, but if you think of the Jordan River, sometimes it flowed wide during the rainy season, and sometimes it got to trickle during the dry season. They had the Sea of Galilee, but it didn't flood. It was there, and there's hills all the way around it. So it's not where you're just going to be getting the water and taking it to the field like you could on the Nile if it's a flat land. The Dead Sea is full of salt, so they're not going to use it. So they could only rely on God for his rains. But when they rained, they had to be ready for it. Okay? They needed to have the plows, the fields plowed and ready to go. They needed to have the seed on standby. They needed to have the sickles ready to harvest. They needed it to be ready when God said it was time. They couldn't be too late. They couldn't be too early. They couldn't plant whenever they wanted, but they had to be ready when God said it was his time. Then they had to be ready to plant. Okay? Does that make sense? So Moses went back. I know I'm skipping back and forth, but I like chapter 8 and chapter 11. So in chapter 8, starting at verse 7, it's kind of a long passage, but it said, Moses said, "The Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity and in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron and of whose hills you can dig copper. And when you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you." Then he said this in verse 11, "Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, And when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness in which were fiery serpents and scorpions, a thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers as it is this day. So it's like, God's going to bring you into this land, and he's going to multiply you. And there's going to be everything you need. You don't lack a thing. Everything is there. But when that happens, don't forget God and where he brought you from. So when we cross into the new, and we look at the work that's set before our eyes, we don't now say, I wish I had time to sit down. And when we stand in our clothes wondering what to wear, and when we sigh at the thought of cleaning our new homes, or think, man, I have to stop and get gas in my car tonight, let's change the way we think. Let's have a heart of thankfulness and gratitude. Okay? It is what God has brought us to. It is God that has given us this power to go into this new place. It is God who has granted us the blessings that he's blessing us with. And so we need to be thankful for that. And we don't need to go, oh, here we go again. No. We need to say, thank you, Lord, because you are the one who has given us power for this wealth. And that God himself has established his covenant with us. So we're not going in with the understanding that we have not gone this way before. We don't know the instructions that he's given us. I mean, even now in our lives, we said over and over, the timetable has changed. It's not what it was when we first started on this path. The timetable has changed, so we don't know what the instructions are now. We think we might. We have an idea. We have the prophecies. But we have to take the time to say, Lord, what are your instructions today? What's your instructions for us right now? What do we need to do right now? Is that house that you promised us, is that still the house? Is that ministry still that ministry? Is that building still that building? Yes, we know what we've been promised and you go what the prophecies have said, but then there's things on top of the prophecies. There's instructions that we have to know. So the Lord will instruct us in those new ways if we just set our hearts to that. So while we set our hearts for his instructions, and we set our hands to do the new things, and then we set our entire being with our whole heart, our soul, and our body to do everything what God has commanded us to do, down to the dot and the tittle. We know that God has brought us from slavery, and he's brought us through the wilderness, and he's bringing us into the new land. And so when I cross over with gladness and with joy, and always remembering who brought us to this point. Amen? So that was what the Lord told me to say tonight. So be encouraged and be blessed.